She had one slice of bread left, dry, stiff, the kind that cracked when bent. Her fingers trembled as she broke it in half. Then again. She held it out toward the camp dog, a dust-colored mutt with ribs like fence slats. It padded closer. One sniff, one bite. Then the dog turned and vanished into the Wyoming dusk. Minutes later it returned, but not alone. And what happened next made the hardened cowboys at Fort Garland lower their rifles and blink away something dangerously close to tears. At an American POW camp deep in the cattle country of 1945 Wyoming, a young Japanese nurse named Fumiko was known for her silence, her stiff posture, and the strange way she always bowed when handed food. She hadn't spoken a word in days, but when the camp hound, a stray mutt the soldiers named Dusty, limped past her that morning, she did something no one expected. She gave him her last piece of bread. What Dusty did with that bread would unravel more than hunger. It would undo fear, bridge enemies, and turn an act of quiet mercy into a legend that no one at the camp, not even the cowboys in uniform, would ever forget. Breakfast at Fort Garland came with the same slow rhythm each morning, the clang of the bell, the rattle of boots on gravel, the shuffle of mess tins along the wooden tables. The air carried the scent of weak coffee and boiled oats, tinged with a faint sourness of damp canvas and cattle dung from the nearby fields. Around the long bench, the Japanese women sat in silence. No one spoke. They rarely did. The guards, many of them former ranch hands turned soldiers, stood near the perimeter of the mess hall, rifles slung loose, eyes half-focused. It was hard to tell who had more distrust in their bones, the prisoners or the ones watching them. Fumiko always ate last. She was 23, though her face seemed older, its edges sharpened by weeks of hunger and years of war. Her eyes held the kind of stillness that made people nervous, not vacant, but watchful. She took her seat at the end of the bench, cradling her tin with both hands. There were 2 slices of white bread today. That was rare. One was already torn and eaten. The other she held between her fingers, soft but stale, the edges dry and slightly curled. She stared at it a long moment, then looked up. Dusty padded into the mess yard like he always did, ribs showing through coarse fur, one ear half bitten off, his steps lopsided from an old injury. No one fed him. No one stopped him either. He was as much a part of the camp as the windmills and the wire, tolerated but unseen. That morning, however, Fumiko saw him, really saw him, and without a word she reached out her hand and held out the bread. The dog hesitated. He had never been this close to her before. He sniffed the air, then the bread, then looked up at her face. Something passed between them. Nothing grand, just the quiet acknowledgment of hunger shared. Dusty stepped forward and took the bread gently from her palm. Then, without pause, he turned and trotted off toward the wire fence, disappearing into the tall prairie grass beyond. The moment might have passed as nothing. A soft-hearted gesture, a strange woman giving food to a mutt. But something about it stopped time. The guards glanced at each other. One of them, Private Lyle Henderson, scratched his head beneath his wide-brimmed hat and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." They expected Dusty to wander off, maybe dig a hole, maybe eat the bread behind the latrine. Instead, within minutes, he returned. But he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him, limping badly, came a figure, gaunt, wrapped in a filthy undershirt, face streaked with dried blood. A man, a prisoner, not one of theirs. The camp erupted. Orders were barked, rifles lifted. The guards fanned out in a sudden, practiced formation. Fumiko didn't move. She just watched as Dusty trotted ahead of the stranger like a guide, leading him straight into the arms of stunned American soldiers. The man collapsed before he reached the mess yard. Dusty circled him once, then sat beside the body, tail twitching, in slow, uncertain rhythm. Later they'd learn he was a German escapee from another POW camp nearly 10 miles away, disoriented, wounded, half-starved, and ready to die. Somehow Dusty had found him, or he had followed Dusty. No one could say for sure. But what they all knew, and what would be repeated again and again in the weeks that followed, was this. The dog had only gone looking after Fumiko gave him her bread. It wasn't just food. It was something else, something no one wanted to put words to. Not yet. But in the uneasy silence that followed, even the toughest guard lowered his rifle just an inch. And one of them, the old cowboy named Reese, took off his hat and said softly, "That damn dog's smarter than the lot of us." "And Fumiko?" She bowed her head. Not in submission, but in quiet reverence, as if to say, "I gave what I could. Now the rest is not mine to own." Before the war took everything, Fumiko had lived in a wooden house tucked behind a narrow canal in Yokohama. Her father was a schoolteacher. Her mother folded paper cranes in the evenings and kept the family altar swept clean. Fumiko had once dreamed of becoming a midwife, but dreams had little weight in a country where duty was louder than desire. She was 17 when she entered the Naval Auxiliary Program. Her hands learned to suture, to fold linen bandages, to smile when asked if she would die for the Emperor. Of course she would. They all would. That was not a question. That was breathing. They were taught Bushido not in scrolls or lectures, but in rituals, silence, obedience, and the rejection of self. To surrender was to shame your bloodline. Better to be swallowed by flame than caught by foreign hands. These weren't just ideas, they were iron laws drilled into bone. At the Naval Infirmary, she treated soldiers with maggot-eaten wounds, hands blown off by grenades, men screaming for mothers they'd never see again. And yet, when the officers entered, she bowed. When asked, she stitched the torn open without flinching. To hesitate was weakness. Weakness was unforgivable. She was stationed in Luzon, the Philippines, when everything fell apart. The bombs came first, gray American planes humming like angry insects in the tropical heat. Then the retreat. Chaos rippled through the compound like fire in dry grass. Officers shouted conflicting orders, trucks overturned. A surgeon told her to burn the medical files. Another screamed for morphine. Fumiko packed what she could into a canvas satchel and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't be captured. That had been made clear. She was found near a dry riverbed 2 days later, her ankle swollen from a fall, her satchel torn open, bandages and surgical scissors scattered like offerings to the earth. The American soldiers who approached her weren't shouting. One had freckles and a torn sleeve. Another held up both hands as if approaching a wild animal. Fumiko closed her eyes, expecting a rifle butt to the temple. Instead, she felt her body being lifted. She bit her tongue until she tasted blood. The first nights in the makeshift detention yard were sleepless. Dozens of Japanese captives huddled under canvas sheets stretched between poles. The air smelled of mud, diesel, and fear. Some wept. Others stared blankly into the distance. No one spoke. No one dared. When food came, small bland portions of rice and canned vegetables, many refused it. Better to starve than be tamed. Fumiko didn't eat for 3 days. Not out of defiance, but disbelief. Every bowl handed to her felt like a trick, a slow knife waiting beneath the broth. When she finally swallowed a spoonful, her body convulsed with hunger. She hated herself for it. Then came the transport train. It was little more than a string of steel boxes baking under the sun, shuttered and bolted. The men were loaded first, then the women. Inside, the air turned sour within an hour. The walls sweated. The floor was slick with human waste and spilled water. Fumiko pressed herself against a corner and counted the rivets in the steel as a way to stay sane. One woman fainted and never woke. Another clawed at the doors, screaming for her child. Days blurred. They were given water twice a day, passed in through a cracked bowl. Bread once, dry and hard. Fumiko tore hers in two and gave half to the woman beside her, whose lips were split from thirst. It was the first act of choice she'd made since capture. Not duty, not ritual, just choice. By the time the train pulled into Fort Garland, Fumiko no longer remembered what her own voice sounded like. The land outside was open and dry, nothing like the jungles she had fled or the city she was raised in. Dust hung in the air like memory, and when the guards shouted in English for them to line up, she obeyed, not from fear, but from absence. Something had been lost on that journey, something sacred. But in its place, something else began to stir. Not yet hope, not yet healing, just the faint, steady rhythm of survival, and perhaps, in the shadow of everything broken, that would be enough. The first thing Fumiko noticed about Fort Garland was the quiet. It wasn't the silence of fear or command, but the strange stillness of wind moving through dry grass. The mountains loomed distant and blue, their peaks holding snow even in summer. Cattle fences ran alongside the outer perimeter of the camp, and somewhere beyond the hills she could hear the faint whine of a harmonica, soft, uncertain, and achingly human. The gates did not scream open. There were no snarling dogs, no fists slamming rifle butts into ribs. The guards who waited were sun-browned, weathered, wearing wide-brimmed hats and boots caked in dust. "Cowboys with rifles," one woman whispered behind her. Another woman wept quietly at the sight of wooden barracks with tin chimneys and laundry lines fluttering in the breeze. They had expected cages. Instead, they found cabins. Inside, the bunks were clean. Thin mattresses, yes, but with real blankets, folded neatly. Tin basins were filled with warm water, and bars of soap rested on the window sills. Fumiko touched the soap as though it might vanish. It smelled faintly of lavender. She washed her hands 3 times that evening, not out of habit, but because she could. At dinner, she received a metal tray with stew, bread, and black coffee. She waited for someone to shout at her for taking too much. No one did. She sat with the others, listening to the scrape of spoons and the low murmur of guards in English. The stew tasted like something from another life. It was salty, rich, and full of things she had forgotten existed: carrots, potatoes, meat. Meat. Her stomach twisted, not from pain, but from disbelief. One woman beside her whispered that she could taste her own tears in the broth. No one laughed. The guards weren't friendly, but they weren't cruel either. They watched without gloating, gave orders without venom. One even held the door open when the women filed out after dinner. He didn't speak, didn't smile, but his gesture was human. That was more unsettling than hostility. And then there was the dog. Fumiko first saw him lying near the water tower, belly to the dirt, his ears twitching at every passing sound. He was no soldier's companion, no leash, no collar, no name that anyone spoke. Just a mutt with mottled fur and eyes like worn glass. His ribs showed. His left hind leg dragged slightly when he walked. Most of the women ignored him. The guards did too. He was part of the scenery, unclaimed, like the wind or the dust. She watched him for days before she approached. Every morning he circled the kitchen, nose to the ground, but no one fed him. He never begged, never barked. He simply watched. Fumiko recognized that kind of stillness. It was the stillness of someone who knew not to ask for more than they'd been given. One afternoon, after work duty folding laundry, she saved half her bread from lunch and walked quietly to where the dog lay in the shade. She crouched, holding out the piece. He didn't move, but his eyes flicked toward her, slow, deliberate. He sniffed once, then rose and took the bread from her hand, his tongue barely brushing her palm. Then he sat, not begging for more, not turning away, simply watching her. From that day on, Dusty followed her at a distance, never close enough to be scolded by the guards, but never far enough to be lost in the background again. The others noticed, they whispered, some laughed, but Fumiko said nothing. She only folded her laundry, washed her face, and saved her bread. She had been trained to serve only the emperor, then to survive only for herself. But this was something else. In the shadow of war and wire, in the dirt beneath the cattle fence, Fumiko found something almost unthinkable, the beginnings of trust. And it came not from men in uniform, not from speeches or rules, but from a stray dog with tired eyes and an empty belly who, like her, simply refused to disappear. The next morning, Dusty was gone. He didn't circle the mess tent, didn't lie in the shade by the tower. Fumiko searched for him without moving her head, just quiet glances while hanging laundry, fetching water. But the shape she had come to expect wasn't there. The absence was louder than any bark. By afternoon, even one of the guards, Corporal Mitchell, muttered something about the dog and scratched his neck like the silence made him itch. That evening, just before sundown, Dusty returned. His gait was different, urgent, unsteady. He moved with purpose, ears pinned back, jaw clenched tight around something long and dark. It flapped as he trotted through the gate where the guards had grown too used to letting him pass. At first they shouted. Then they noticed what he was carrying. Fabric, stiff with blood, torn at the edges. Mitchell stepped forward and crouched, reaching for it. Dusty dropped the scrap, growled low in his throat, then turned back toward the fence. He looked over his shoulder once, then took off again, sprinting through the dust, his limp barely slowing him down. Something about the way he moved, the sheer insistence in it, broke through the guard's boredom like a match strike. The gate creaked open. 3 men followed, boots crunching in the gravel, rifles slung but ready. Fumiko watched from the corner of the barrack steps, her hands still damp from rinsing sheets. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dry field. She didn't move, but her eyes followed them, the guards and Dusty. It took less than an hour. When they returned, there was another man with them, or rather a shape that once was a man. He stumbled between the guards, face hollowed out, eyes sunken into bruised sockets. His legs were barely holding him. Dust caked his skin, blood streaked his shirt, and there, unmistakably stitched on his tattered uniform, was the faded insignia of a German POW. The camp buzzed like a beehive kicked underfoot. Prisoners were gathered back to quarters, lights turned on, officers whispered with clipped urgency, but what no one could forget, what not a single man or woman would deny, was how the guards had found the escapee. Dusty had led them to him. Down past the edge of the ravine, near an old dry creek bed where the German had collapsed with a shattered leg and a fever burning through his skull. Dusty had circled him, barked once, then waited. Some said it was instinct, some said luck. But those who had watched the bread pass from Fumiko's hand to the dog's mouth the day before didn't believe in coincidence. Fumiko said nothing. She stood on the barrack porch, hands folded, her face unreadable. But her eyes followed Dusty as he trotted back into camp, tongue lolling, tail twitching with something not quite pride, something softer. When Dusty passed by her, he didn't stop, but he glanced up at her once, and for a moment she imagined she could hear a sound deep in her chest. Not a voice, not a memory, but a stirring, as if something she had buried long ago was scratching at the surface again. She pressed her hand against her heart. The dog moved on. The German prisoner was taken to the infirmary. The guards didn't speak to the women about it, but news travels through wire like wind through grass. They all knew. The camp had changed. Dusty was no longer just a dog. Fumiko was no longer just another face behind the fence. Something had passed between them, a question answered not with words, but with bread and bone, trust and return. And though Fumiko still said nothing, when she passed the mess tent that night, she paused, pulled her half-roll from her pocket, and broke it cleanly in two. One piece she kept. The other she placed gently beneath the water tower, on the earth still warm from the day's sun. By dawn, the bread was gone. Dusty had taken it, as he always did now. But that morning, Fumiko didn't return to her chores. Instead, she stood outside the barracks, arms folded tight around herself, eyes fixed on the infirmary shack near the edge of camp. A single guard paced outside its door. Beyond the thin wooden walls, the German prisoner lay unconscious, burning with fever and broken in places no one could yet name. She waited until the guard turned to light a cigarette, then stepped off the gravel path and walked toward the infirmary. She didn't ask permission. She didn't knock. She simply pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The heat inside was thick and sour. Sweat, iodine, blood, and something older. The American medic, a young man with a crooked nose and sleeves rolled past his elbows, looked up sharply. "You can't be in here," he started to say, but stopped when he saw her eyes. Fumiko said nothing. She just moved to the basin, washed her hands, and began tearing strips of clean cloth from the folded linen on the shelf. The medic stared at her for a long moment, the kind of stare not made of anger, but uncertainty. Then he glanced at the unconscious man. His hands hovered for a moment over a bloodied bandage, and then, slowly, he stepped back. Fumiko knelt by the cot. The German's leg was shattered. Pus clung to the edges of the wound, and his skin was hot to the touch. She worked quietly, not fast, not slow, with the rhythm of someone who had done this before, in jungles and bunkers, under fire and without sleep. She cleaned the wound, applied fresh gauze, dabbed his forehead with a cloth cooled from the basin. The man groaned, shifting slightly, but did not wake. The medic stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. This was not about sides anymore. Not empire, not America, not even Japan. It was just flesh and pain, and the hands that chose to answer one with the other. When she finally stood, her knees ached. She washed her hands again, slower this time. The medic stepped forward, reaching for his notebook, but hesitated. You were a nurse?" he asked. Fumiko nodded once. He didn't ask more. That night, something shifted. She returned to her barracks without a word, but the other women looked at her differently. Not with judgment, not even surprise, just a kind of quiet understanding. Some nodded slightly. One left an extra spoonful of stew on her tray. The next morning, the guard outside the infirmary opened the door before she reached it. Fumiko returned daily. She cleaned wounds, measured fevers, changed bandages. The medic, whose name she learned was Lyle, began leaving tools out before she arrived. He didn't thank her. She didn't ask. But one afternoon he offered her a biscuit from his coat pocket, dry and crumbling, but still warm. She took it, ate it slowly. Dusty began sleeping by the infirmary steps. The guards noticed. They said little, but their stares softened. One even tipped his hat when she passed. The same man who once barked orders now held the infirmary door open each morning. Nothing was spoken. Nothing needed to be. Fumiko had been trained to follow, to obey, to heal when told, and to stop when ordered. But here, in a camp built on contradiction, she had done something unthinkable. She had chosen to care. Without command, without permission, without flag or anthem or salute. It was not rebellion. It was something harder. It was mercy, chosen, carried, and offered freely, even to those she'd been taught to hate. The men who guarded Fort Garland had never imagined their war would look like this. They were ranchers' sons from Texas, oil rig hands from Casper, cowboys who'd traded spurs for boots and rifles. Many had signed up after Pearl Harbor, full of spit and duty, ready to fight Japs in the Pacific or storm bunkers in Europe. But instead, they found themselves posted on American soil, babysitting women behind barbed wire. It wasn't glory. It wasn't even close. To them, the prisoners weren't people. They were the enemy, faceless, voiceless, a sea of bowed heads and foreign syllables. The women never spoke unless ordered to. They marched in line, worked the laundry, cleaned their quarters. From behind the fence, it was easy to keep them small, until Fumiko did something no one expected. She gave up her bread for a dog. It was Private Henderson who saw it first. The quiet way she broke the crust, the way Dusty took it from her palm without fear. He mentioned it that night over poker, between sips of bitter coffee and a handful of twos. No one paid much mind. Then Dusty came back with blood on his muzzle. And then the German, the ghost of a man, was found alive because that same dog wouldn't stop barking. And the question passed like smoke through the mess hall and down the bunkhouses. Did that Japanese girl send him? Corporal Reese, whose drawl was thicker than molasses and whose opinions had once included that all prisoners should eat dust, stood by the mess hall door and watched her carry clean linen into the infirmary without being told. He didn't spit, didn't speak, just watched. "She gave up her bread for a mutt," someone said again the next morning, this time with a little less sneer and a little more wonder. And somehow it kept spreading. Fumiko never confirmed it, never corrected it. She just kept doing what she did, rising early, working quietly, folding with precision, and pausing each evening near the tower where Dusty now waited like a soldier on post. The guards noticed. Not just the dog, her. They noticed how she moved, like someone who still believed in purpose, how she never took more than she was given, how her hands, though calloused and red from soap, held a kind of grace the war had burned out of most people. One morning, when her water pail cracked, Sergeant Lyle brought her another. No words, just a nod. Another time she found an extra pair of gloves tucked beneath her washboard. Small things, quiet offerings, like her bread had been. And then came the moment no one expected. She was offered coffee. It was bitter and burned, but it came from the pot the guards drank from, poured into a chipped enamel mug, and held out to her like a strange, tentative handshake. Fumiko took it, bowed slightly, and walked away without sipping. The next morning she returned the mug. Clean. No one said a word. But something changed in the air. The war hadn't ended. The fence still stood. Orders still ruled. But between the clatter of trays and the shuffle of boots, a subtle reshaping had begun, not with speeches or treaties, but with crumbs of bread and sips of coffee. with glances held just a second longer than needed, with Dusty, who now sat proudly beside the barracks like he belonged to everyone and no one at once. Fumiko didn't smile. Not often. But when Reese tipped his hat one morning and said, "You know, you ain't what I expected," she bowed. Not in shame, not in deference, but in something closer to agreement. Neither was he. It began with a second roll. No one said a word, not even when the first woman, one of the older ones, her hair streaked silver, knelt beside the mess tent wall and placed her crust gently into the dirt. Dusty was already waiting. He sniffed it once, then sat beside her as she stood and walked away without looking back. That was all. No speech, no nod, just an offering and a silence deeper than any shout. The next day, 2 more women did the same. By week's end, it was a line. Each evening after dinner, as the sun curled low over the hills and the wind carried the scent of cattle and pine, a quiet procession of prisoners stepped forward. One by one, they left something for Dusty. Not all of them had bread. Some gave a sliver of potato, a shred of meat, even an apple core if they'd been lucky enough to trade for one. It didn't matter. Dusty accepted each gift the same way, without beg or bark, and lay down beside the pile like a sentry watching over memory itself. The guards watched, too. At first, they muttered about manipulation. "They're trying to soften us," one said. "Make us forget." But the theory didn't hold. The women asked for nothing in return. They still obeyed orders, still worked the laundry lines, still stood for roll call. But something had shifted, not outside the fence, but inside, because after the bread came the sharing. Within the barracks, things changed. Blankets were swapped to cover the sick. Those who had mended sleeves before began repairing others' clothes. One prisoner offered to help the guards patch a torn tent flap near the edge of the compound. She did it in silence, her stitches perfect, her back straight as a ruler. When she finished, she bowed once and returned to her chores. No one told her to. No one thanked her. But the tent held strong through the next storm. A garden began to grow behind Barrack 4. It wasn't much, just a few rows of weeds cleared out and poked with carrot seeds and half-sprouted onions. No one asked permission, but the guards didn't tear it up either. Maybe they were curious, maybe they simply didn't care, or maybe they were starting to see it the same way Dusty did. Not as a threat, but a possibility, because Dusty was more than a dog now. He moved between fences like a ghost with paws, slipping through shadows and patrols with ease. The guards called him "that damn mutt" when he stole jerky, and "good boy" when he barked at rattlesnakes near the fence line. But they all knew Dusty wasn't theirs. He wasn't the prisoners either. He had no master, no orders, no side. He just was. And in that strange neutrality, he became something neither army had intended, a bridge. The children in the camp, the few born to POW mothers before surrender, crawled toward him when he lay in the sun. The guards didn't stop them. One even tossed a ball once. Dusty didn't fetch, but he licked the child's hand. By late summer, when the heat thickened and the ground cracked beneath the posts, even the guards stopped pretending they didn't see the ritual. A few tipped their hats when the bread line formed. One guard, young, nervous, always chewing tobacco, began leaving scraps of jerky near the pump where Dusty liked to nap. And always Fumiko was there, at the front of the line or the end, her bread in hand, her eyes steady. She said nothing, but everyone watched her. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't resistance. It was transformation, a slow, steady erosion of hatred, worn down not by argument, but by gestures, crumbs, glances, a dog who would not pick a side, and a woman who had already lost hers, choosing, every single day, to act like she still had something to give. Dusty disappeared again on a cold morning in late autumn, slipping past the fence line before the guards finished their first patrol. At first, no one paid it much mind. The dog had always wandered, a creature answering to nothing but hunger and instinct. But as the hours ticked past and the sun climbed higher over the Wyoming fields, a quiet unease began to settle in the camp. Dusty never stayed gone this long. By midday, Corporal Mitchell noticed the footprints near the ravine, small, uneven, and leading straight into the line of cottonwoods behind the old cattle trail. He called for 2 other guards. They followed the tracks, rifles slung but hanging loose, as though even the weapons understood they were unnecessary for this mission. Fumiko stood at the edge of the fence, watching them go. The wind pulled at her sleeves. Something inside her, something small but insistent, urged her to follow with her eyes until the guards vanished behind the trees. Dusty was out there, and Dusty never wandered without purpose. The search took the men nearly an hour. When they returned, Dusty trotted proudly at the lead, a dirt-stained object clamped carefully in his jaws. Behind the dog, Mitchell carried something else pressed against his chest, small, fragile, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, so old it seemed ready to dissolve. The camp fell into a hush. Dusty dropped the object at Fumiko's feet. It was a wooden carving, the shape of a horse, crudely whittled, the paint faded. One wheel was missing, the other barely clung to a thin wooden axle. It wasn't much, just a child's toy, something lost long before any of them arrived. But then Mitchell spoke, his voice oddly soft. "There's more out there," he said, "a place he kept coming back to, like—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The guards had found a shallow depression beneath the trees, not a grave, not exactly, but a place marked by time. Scraps of fabric, a small shoe, a brittle letter, half buried, written in a woman's careful hand. Dusty had pawed at it, whined, and nudged it toward the men, as though insisting they take it. Something shifted then, something subtle, something seismic. Fumiko bent, lifted the toy in both hands, and held it carefully against her chest. Dusty pressed against her leg and stayed there, trembling with a fatigue she had never seen in him before. She knelt slowly, looking into his tired amber eyes, and then, for the first time since arriving at the camp, she spoke. One sentence, soft as breath, fragile as memory. He was not always alone. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. The guards froze. The prisoners turned toward her. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting. It wasn't the sentence itself that shook the camp. It was the voice, gentle, breaking, human, rising from a woman who had buried every piece of herself for survival. She wasn't talking about the dog alone. They all understood that. She was speaking of loss, of belonging, of things taken by war and buried by time. From that moment, Dusty changed in their eyes. He was no longer just a stray hound scrounging for scraps or guiding them to lost men in the fields. He became something else, a keeper of memory, a wanderer between worlds, a reminder that suffering did not belong to one flag or another. Some called him a ghost dog. Others said he carried stories in his paws. But all agreed he was no longer simply a dog. He was myth. And Fumiko, in speaking that single fragile sentence, became something more too. No longer a silent shadow behind wire, but a voice rising slowly back into the world. Are you enjoying this story? If so, please like the video and comment below, telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The war was over, but the wire still held. News came through slowly, muffled by paperwork and politics, by lists and logistics and whispered uncertainty. The emperor had surrendered. The empire had broken. Cities lay in ash. But in Fort Garland the gates remained closed. The fences hummed with wind, not electricity, but the separation still felt real. The women stood in formation each morning, counted and catalogued, their lives suspended like breath held too long. Repatriation, the guards said, would come soon. But soon was a word without teeth. No one knew how many families had survived the firebombing. No one could say if ships would return to Yokohama or Nagasaki or anywhere in between. All the prisoners could do was wait, and in that waiting everything felt heavier, even the air, even the sun. Fumiko woke early now, before the bugle. She would sit near the fence line where the wind moved through the prairie grass, legs folded beneath her, hands resting in her lap. Dusty always found her. He'd curl beside her knees, snout twitching, eyes half closed. He no longer wandered far. His bones were slower now, his muzzle grayed like frost creeping in before snow. Each morning she saved him a biscuit, sometimes from her own tray, sometimes bartered. It was a quiet ritual, one the guards no longer questioned. In fact, they'd begun looking away, not in disrespect, but in something closer to reverence, a recognition that some bonds weren't theirs to interrupt. One day she wrote a letter. The camp clerk provided the paper, just a sheet, thin and yellowing. The pencil was dull, and her hands shook as she pressed it to the surface. She had not written in years. She had no address, but she wrote anyway. To my mother and sisters, if you live, I remember you. If you do not, I carry your breath with mine. The sun is warm here. The land is quiet. I am not forgotten. Neither are you. She folded it slowly, with the same precision she used for bandages. Then she handed it to the clerk. He didn't ask questions. He simply slipped it into the outbound pile and offered a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Later that week, during roll call, Dusty didn't rise. He lay at Fumiko's feet as she stood at attention, his head resting on one paw, his breath slow but steady. The guards began to call names, the same ritual every day. But when they reached hers, something strange happened. She didn't move. Instead, she looked down, and slowly, with the gentlest motion, she knelt and placed her hand on Dusty's head. The line behind her didn't speak. The guards hesitated. Then, for reasons no one could quite explain, the officer in charge simply skipped her name. That morning, the fence felt thinner. It wasn't the wire. That was still there, rusting in the cold. It wasn't the watchtower or the patrol routes. It was something else, something softer, paper thin. A wall made not of steel, but of assumption, the kind that crumbles slowly under the weight of shared silence and remembered loss. The war had ended on paper, but in Fort Garland, peace was arriving another way. Through a biscuit passed between hands, a letter without reply, a dog asleep beneath a prisoner's shadow. And in that moment, under the watchful sun and silent wind, Fumiko became something no uniform could define. She became human again. The photograph is black and white, faded at the corners, with a tear running through the top right edge like a scar time itself forgot to mend. In it, a woman kneels on dry earth, her head bowed just slightly, her hands outstretched. Between them, between her palms and the dust, sits a dog with his ears perked and tail curled close. You can't see the fence, but you feel it, off frame, present, as if the wire still watches. No one wrote her name on the back, no one needed to. The image would sit quietly in a filing drawer for nearly 3 decades, misfiled beneath medical support staff, POWs, female. It was rediscovered by a junior archivist working late one night at a veterans museum in Cheyenne. She was looking for something else. She found this instead. And something about the stillness, the grace in that single moment made her stop. It was Dusty who gave the photo life again. His name, at least, had survived. The guards, many of them long retired, spoke of him often. That hound knew more about decency than most officers, one said in an oral history interview in the 1970s. Another swore the dog had saved 3 lives, not just the wounded German. He barked like the devil when that fire broke near the storage tent. If not for him, half the winter rations would have gone up in smoke. In the ranch towns dotting the plains around Fort Garland, Dusty had become more than a memory. He was a story, a kind of prairie ghost. Children whispered his name during campfires. Mothers left scraps out for strays, just in case. And every so often some old cowboy would lean back in a wooden chair, pipe smoke curling through the barn rafters, and say, "That dog once taught a prisoner how to heal." And then they'd grow quiet. Because the dog's story was never separate from the woman's, even if most of them couldn't remember her name. They remembered what she did. The bread, the silence, the kneeling in the cold, the way she looked not at the guards, not at the sky, but at the dog, as though he carried some piece of her no human could hold. No one knew what happened to her after the war. Some said she was among the last to leave. Others believed she never made it home. One aging quartermaster remembered she was sick near the end, coughing blood, thin as bone. But the records had gaps, so her trail ended, as many do, not in a date or a grave, but in a pause. And yet, somehow, she endured. The archivist who found the photo framed it. She placed it in a glass case beneath the headline, "Mercy at Fort Garland." And people came. Veterans, students, tourists, passing through on their way to Yellowstone. They lingered. Some left notes. One child left a biscuit wrapped in wax paper. No plaque named the woman. But the image spoke clearly, and people listened. They saw a dog, loyal and calm. They saw a prisoner offering what little she had left. And they saw something else, too, something between the lines, between the hands and the earth. Not surrender, not defiance, something older, wiser, compassion. It outlasted the war, outlasted the fence, outlasted even the names, just dust and memory. If this story moved you, please like the video and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Stories like these deserve to live on.